Imagine a sun-scorched highway on the 21st of June, 1941, winding its way toward the ancient walls of Damascus. A cloud of dust rises on the horizon, but it isn't kicked up by the jeeps of the Free French forces, who were politically destined to liberate the city. Instead, the roar of engines belongs to the men of the 2/3 Australian Machine Gun Battalion, their slouch hats pulled tight against the wind. They are pushing forward with an urgency that borders on obsession, their eyes fixed on the prize, the capital of Syria. This wasn't just a military objective. It was a race, a final sprint to be the first to plant their flag in a city that had seen conquerors come and go for millennia. Waiting down the road, covered in dust and seething with indignation, stood Major General Paul Legentilhomme, the commander of the 1st Free French Division. His arm was still in a sling, a memento from the fierce fighting earlier in the campaign, a visible symbol of the price the Free French had already paid. He was poised at the head of his motorcade, ready to lead the triumphant procession into Damascus, a moment that was supposed to be a massive propaganda victory for Charles de Gaulle's exiled forces. It was their moment, a chance to show the world that France was still fighting. But the Australians, with what some called larrikinism and others called pure disregard, had other plans. As the Australian convoy sped past, they showered the French general and his staff with grit and dust, leaving him waving his one good arm futilely at the disappearing trucks. Legentilhomme was forced to jump out of the way, brushing off his uniform as he watched the Australians barrel into the city he was meant to liberate. This iconic, almost comical, moment on the outskirts of Damascus perfectly encapsulates the entire Syrian campaign. It was a bitter, hard-fought victory that would be immediately overshadowed by greater events, and then slowly erased from the popular memory of World War II. The story of how Australians came to be racing the Free French into Damascus is a complex tale of imperial politics, strategic desperation, and brutal mountain warfare. To understand it, we have to rewind to the dark days of mid-1941. France had fallen to the Nazis the previous year, and its massive overseas empire, including the mandates of Syria and Lebanon, had fallen under the control of the Vichy government. These were not willing allies of Hitler, but they were neutral in a way that heavily favored the Axis, allowing German aircraft to use Syrian airfields as staging posts to attack British interests in Iraq. For British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, this situation was an unacceptable threat looming over his empire's most vital asset, the Suez Canal. If the Germans solidified their hold on Syria, they would have a perfect launching pad to strike at the canal from the north, potentially severing Britain's lifeline to India and its oil supplies. The recent German victories in Greece and Crete were still fresh wounds, demonstrating the Wehrmacht's ability to project power into the eastern Mediterranean. The British High Command in the Middle East, led by General Archibald Wavell, was already stretched thin fighting Rommel in North Africa. Wavell was utterly opposed to opening another front. He had already endured grueling campaigns and felt his forces were on the verge of breaking. When Churchill ordered him to draw up plans for an invasion of Syria, Wavell protested bitterly, even threatening to resign. He saw it as a dangerous distraction, a drain on resources he simply didn't have. But the pressure from London, heavily influenced by the charismatic leader of the Free French, Charles de Gaulle, was relentless. De Gaulle argued that the Vichy troops in Syria would not fight, they would welcome the Free French as brothers and lay down their arms. This promise of a swift, bloodless campaign was the bait that Churchill swallowed. The man on the ground, tasked with turning this political gamble into a military reality, was Lieutenant General Henry Maitland Jumbo Wilson. Wilson set up his headquarters in the luxurious King David Hotel in Jerusalem, 100 miles away from the front lines. From this comfortable distance, he devised a plan for Operation Exporter, which was to begin on the night of June 7, 1941. His strategy was a three-pronged advance into Syria and Lebanon, a plan so predictable that it would later be heavily criticized as the most obvious, the easiest, and possibly the least effective way to proceed. The main burden of this risky operation fell not on jaded British regulars, but on the fresh-faced, yet battle-hardened, soldiers of the 7th Australian Division. They were assigned the two most critical axes of advance. On the left, along the Lebanese coast, the 21st Australian Brigade would push north towards the port cities of Sidon and ultimately Beirut. In the centre, the 25th Australian Brigade would drive inland from the Sea of Galilee, heading for the strategic Bekaa Valley and the vital airbase at Rayak. Their mission was to punch through some of the most rugged and unforgiving terrain in the Middle East. Meanwhile, the third prong, aimed directly at Damascus on the right flank, was assigned to a mixed force. This group consisted of the 5th Indian Infantry Brigade and the 1st Free French Division, a combination that was politically symbolic but militarily fragile. They were to advance from Transjordan, capture Daraa and Quneitra, and then push north to take the Syrian capital. The hope was that the presence of the Free French would trigger a mass defection of Vichy troops, turning the advance into a parade. In their initial optimism, some Australian troops were even ordered to wear their distinctive slouch hats instead of steel helmets, a gesture meant to remind the French defenders of the diggers' legendary exploits in the Great War and encourage them to give up. This nostalgic gesture would prove to be a deadly piece of sentimentality. Within hours of crossing the border in the dead of night, the Australians realized that the Vichy French were not going to be their friends. The initial resistance was fierce, professional, and utterly determined. The slouch hats were quickly stuffed into packs as steel helmets were pulled on, the sharp crack of French rifles and the chatter of machine guns making it brutally clear that this was not going to be a walkover. The men of the 7th Division were walking into a hornet's nest, facing an enemy equipped with modern French artillery, tanks, and a deep-seated sense of honor that compelled them to fight. On the coastal sector, the 21st Brigade's advance was immediately halted by the first major natural obstacle, the Litani River. The Vichy French had destroyed the bridges and dug in on the northern bank, their machine guns and artillery zeroed in on the crossing points. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 9th, the Australians attempted to force a crossing, supported by naval gunfire from Royal Navy ships offshore. It was a chaotic and bloody affair. The assault troops had to paddle across in flimsy boats under a hail of fire, suffering heavy casualties as they struggled to establish a foothold on the enemy-held bank. The fighting along the coast settled into a brutal rhythm. The Australians would have to clear the Vichy French from every rocky ridge, every ancient village, and every stubbornly defended fort. They advanced slowly but steadily, learning the hard craft of mountain warfare on the job. Sidon, with its historic Crusader castle, was finally occupied on June 15th after days of intense house-to-house fighting. But every mile gained came at a cost, and the rapid victory predicted by the strategists in Jerusalem was already a distant memory. The men were fighting and dying in the scorching heat, plagued by flies and the constant threat of snipers. In the central sector, the 25th Australian Brigade initially had more success, capturing the town of Merdjayne on June 11th. This was a crucial crossroads town, and its capture opened up the possibility of a rapid advance towards Rayak. But the Vichy French commander, General Henri Dentz, was not a man to surrender his mandate without a fight. While the Australians were celebrating their victory, Dentz was regrouping his forces, preparing a devastating counterstroke that would exploit the overstretched and thinly spread Allied lines. The situation was about to go from difficult to desperate. The most rapid progress in the first week was actually made by the Indian and Free French forces on the right flank. They pushed hard towards Damascus, capturing Daraa and sweeping north. It seemed, for a brief moment, that de Gaulle's prediction might come true on that particular front. But the Vichy French were merely falling back to stronger defensive positions, drawing the Allies deeper into the rugged foothills surrounding Damascus. They were setting a trap, and the overextended Indian and Free French columns, strung out along poor roads, were walking right into it. On June 14th, General Dentz sprung his trap. Vichy forces launched a massive, coordinated counterattack that struck deep into the Allied lines of communication. They recaptured the town of Ezra, cutting the supply lines to the forces advancing on Damascus. Further west, they struck at the central sector, recapturing Merdjayne in a furious assault that caught the undermanned Australian garrison completely off guard. The Vichy French were not just fighting, they were winning, driving wedges between the three Allied prongs and threatening to defeat them in detail. The news of the fall of Merdjayne sent shockwaves through Wilson's headquarters in Jerusalem. The entire Allied plan was on the verge of collapse. The Vichy counterattack had not only retaken a strategic town, but had also surrounded and captured the bulk of the 1st Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, at Kenitra. The Allied force, which had been told they would be greeted as liberators, was now fighting for its life against a determined and skillful enemy. The situation was so dire that a change in command was inevitable. The armchair general in the King David Hotel had to go. On June 18th, in the midst of this crisis, command of the entire Syria-Lebanon campaign was handed over to an Australian, Lieutenant General John Laverack, the commander of the 7th Australian Division. This was a significant moment, placing an Australian in charge of a complex, multinational operation for the first time in the war. Laverack was a tough, competent professional, and he immediately set about stabilizing the front. His first priority was to restore the situation around Merdjayne and to get the stalled advance on Damascus moving again. The fight for Merdjayne turned into a seesaw battle of attrition. Australian infantry, supported by whatever artillery they could scrape together, launched attack after attack to dislodge the Vichy defenders. It was here that a young artillery lieutenant from Manly, New South Wales, named Arthur Roden Cutler, would begin to etch his name into the annals of Australian military history. Serving as a forward observer, Cutler repeatedly exposed himself to heavy fire to direct his guns, knocking out enemy posts and inspiring the infantry around him with his coolness and courage. For days, Cutler was seemingly everywhere at once. He would creep forward to within yards of the enemy lines to spot targets, then race back to relay coordinates. He manned a captured Vichy gun to fire at his own ammunition dump to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. He became, in the words of his citation, a byword amongst forward troops with which he worked. The fighting around Merdjayne was a microcosm of the entire campaign, vicious, close quarters, and largely unheralded, yet demanding a level of heroism that is hard to fathom. While Cutler and his comrades were battling for Merdjayne, The situation for the force on the Damascus Road had become critical. The Indian troops of the 5th Indian Brigade, now commanded by Brigadier Wilfred Lloyd, had resumed their advance. They bypassed the main Vichy defences and, in a daring night march on June 18, managed to capture the village of Meza, on the high ground just west of Damascus. It was a brilliant tactical success that put them on the doorstep of their objective. But their success was also their vulnerability. They were isolated, miles ahead of the main force, and running low on supplies. The Vichy French reacted with typical speed and aggression. They surrounded the isolated Indian battalion in Meza, pounding them with artillery and tanks. The Indian troops, cut off and with no anti-tank guns, fought desperately, holding on to their positions by their fingernails. Meanwhile, the Free French forces, who were supposed to be advancing to relieve the pressure, were themselves held up by fierce resistance at Khudam. The pincer movement had failed, and the battalion in Meza was facing annihilation. For 2 days, the trapped Indian soldiers held out. They had no food, their water was running out, and their ammunition was down to the last few rounds per man. Wounded soldiers lay in the scorching heat with no medical supplies. On the 20th of June, with Vichy tanks now shelling their positions at point-blank range, the Indian commander made the agonizing decision to show a white flag, hoping for a truce to evacuate the wounded. It was a desperate gamble to buy time, but it was tragically misinterpreted. The Vichy French, seeing the white flag, rushed the Indian positions, assuming it was a signal of surrender. The surviving defenders, some armed only with bayonets, were overwhelmed and taken prisoner. The entire battalion, which had fought so valiantly to reach the gates of Damascus, was lost. The road to the city was now wide open for the Vichy forces, who could use Meza as a strongpoint to dominate the approaches. The fall of Damascus, which had seemed so close, had just been snatched away. That same evening, a relieving force finally fought its way to Meza. Leading this force was the Australian 2/3 Infantry Battalion. They stormed into the village, expecting to link up with their Indian comrades, but they were met with a horrifying silence. The village was empty save for the dead. The Indian soldiers were gone, marched off into captivity. The Australians had arrived just hours too late. Now, the job of taking Damascus fell squarely on their shoulders, and the Vichy French were dug in and waiting. Throughout the night of June 20th and into the morning of the 21st, the Australians fought a series of brutal actions around Meza. They attacked a line of stone forts overlooking the village and the Quneitra Road, positions that bristled with machine guns. In one action, a company of 59 Australians was briefly captured by a Vichy counterattack before being freed by their mates in a vicious bayonet charge at dawn. It was a soldiers' battle, fought in rocky, dusty terrain, where the outcome was decided by the courage of individual sections and platoons. Simultaneously, another Australian company was dispatched on a flanking mission to cut the road leading northwest from Damascus to Beirut. They fought their way into the Barada Gorge, a narrow, precipitous pass, and set up a roadblock deep in enemy territory. For 12 hours, this small force held the gorge against repeated French attacks supported by tanks and armoured cars. They turned back every assault, clinging to the rocky slopes and pouring fire down on the French columns, sealing the fate of the Vichy garrison in the city. With the Australians holding the ring around Meza and cutting the Beirut road, the pressure on Damascus became unbearable for the Vichy commander. The Free French, finally managing to get their act together with the support of British artillery and Australian machine guns, captured Khudam on the morning of June 21st. The noose was tightening. The Vichy forces in the city, now facing the prospect of being completely cut off, knew the game was up. The ancient capital, coveted by so many empires over the centuries, was about to fall to the Allies. And that is how, around 11 o'clock in the morning on June 21st, 1941, the Australian machine gunners of the 2/3 Battalion found themselves on the road to Damascus, racing the dust cloud of the Free French motorcade. They had fought their way through the Barada Gorge, they had retaken the forts at Meza, and they were not about to let some Frenchmen who had been stuck in reserve take the credit for their bloody work. They were diggers, and they had a point to prove. They entered the city as conquerors, their slouch hats a symbol of the Antipodean grit that had turned the tide. The moment the Australians entered Damascus, the centuries-old city fell silent. The French garrison, battered and cut off, formally surrendered. The race was over. The Australians had won. For a brief moment, they were the heroes of the hour, the men who had beaten the Vichy French to one of the Middle East's greatest prizes. But their victory lap would be brutally short. As they began to consolidate their positions in the city, a world-changing event was unfolding thousands of miles away, an event that would shove their triumph off the front pages and into the forgotten corners of history. The very next day, on June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the colossal German invasion of the Soviet Union. The world's attention instantly snapped away from the deserts of Syria and towards the endless Eastern Front. The drama of a few thousand colonial troops capturing an ancient city was utterly eclipsed by the clash of titans, a war of annihilation involving millions of men on a front stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. The Australians in Damascus, still catching their breath from the fight, suddenly found themselves fighting a ghost war that no one back home was watching anymore.